A flight between two African cities should be simple, short, direct, affordable. But for decades, it was none of those. Aircraft traced long, inefficient arcs across the sky, not because geography demanded it, but because history did. Routes bent around old hubs. Fuel burned where distance did not require it. Time was lost, not in the air, but in the architecture of dependence. And the cost was never abstract. It was paid by traders waiting for goods, by families priced out of movement, by nations locked into logistics that drained more than money. They drained choice. For years, this inefficiency was treated as technical noise, a problem for engineers, a footnote in balance sheets. But something has begun to change. Quietly, methodically, African skies are being redrawn. Fuel is being saved. Time is being reclaimed. Control is being reconsidered. Not through grand declarations, not through dramatic ruptures, but through optimization of routes, of systems, of sovereignty itself. Because efficiency, when reclaimed, is never neutral. It shifts leverage. It reshapes power. And it does so without asking for permission. This is not a story about airplanes. It is a story about who decides the path forward and who no longer flies in circles. Stay with us. This is not about distance. It is about dignity in motion. The problem did not begin with fuel prices, and it did not begin with aircraft. It began with lines drawn in the sky. For much of modern aviation history, Africa's air routes were not designed to connect African cities to one another. They were designed to serve distant hubs, inherited systems, and external logics that had little to do with efficiency on the continent itself. A flight from one West African capital to another could take longer than a journey out of the continent altogether. Not because the distance was greater, but because the route was bent, curved, redirected through spaces that made sense on paper decades ago, but no longer made sense for the people paying the price. This was not a technical accident. It was structural. Airspace control, routing conventions, bilateral restrictions, insurance frameworks, and legacy navigation corridors all combined to create a system where African skies were open, but not truly owned. Movement existed, but choice did not. And over time, the cost accumulated. Fuel burned unnecessarily as aircraft followed predetermined corridors rather than the shortest viable paths. Crews logged longer hours. Maintenance cycles tightened. Tickets became more expensive. Cargo margins shrank. What appeared as a commercial inefficiency was, in reality, a slow economic drain. For ordinary citizens, this meant fewer connections and higher prices. For businesses, it meant delayed supply chains and limited regional trade. For states, it meant aviation systems that consume value rather than multiplying it. Yet for years, this reality was normalized. High costs were explained away as geography. Inefficiency was blamed on scale, and the deeper architecture of dependence remained largely unchallenged. On paper, reforms existed. Agreements promising open skies and continental integration were signed. Frameworks envisioned seamless movement across borders. The language of liberalization entered official documents. But in practice, implementation stalled. Protectionism lingered. Coordination fractured. National interests pulled against collective gain. As a result, the sky remained divided, not by clouds but by caution. Meanwhile, global aviation evolved. Other regions experimented with flexible routing, integrated airspace management, and cooperative navigation systems. They shortened distances without moving cities. They saved fuel without sacrificing safety. They treated efficiency not as an operational detail, but as a strategic asset. In contrast, many African routes remained locked into rigid pathways. Aircraft flew where they had always flown, even when better options existed. Not because pilots lacked skill, but because systems resisted change. This resistance carried a price. Every additional minute in the air translated into cost. Every unnecessary detour reinforced reliance on the external hubs. Every inefficiency widened the gap between potential and performance. And yet, beneath the surface, pressure was building. Traffic volumes were growing. Urban centers were expanding. Intra-African trade conversations intensified. Logistics became central to economic strategy. Quietly, the question began to shift from why is flying here so expensive to who decides the route in the first place. Because routes are not neutral. They encode priorities. They reflect power. Whoever designs the path determines who benefits from movement and who pays for it. This was the moment when aviation stopped being just about transport and started being about sovereignty. Not sovereignty in the dramatic sense of flags and speeches, but in the practical sense, control over systems, optimization of resources, and the ability to choose the shortest path forward. For the first time in years, attention turned upward, not to the aircraft themselves, but to the invisible architecture guiding them. Could African skies be reorganized around African needs? Could efficiency be reclaimed without external permission? Could technical adjustments unlock political and economic leverage? These were not rhetorical questions. They were operational ones. And as regulators, engineers, and regional bodies began to revisit how the sky was managed, something subtle but profound started to happen. The old routes no longer looked inevitable. The detours no longer felt justified. And the idea that inefficiency was the price of participation began to collapse. Because once a system is recognized as designed, it can be redesigned. And that realization marked the beginning of a quiet shift. But what followed was not a speech nor a treaty. It was something far more consequential. The shift did not arrive with a press conference. There were no banners, no triumphant headlines. Instead, it emerged in control rooms, planning documents, and recalculated trajectories, places where power rarely announces itself. For the first time in years, parts of African airspace began to experiment with a different idea, that aircraft did not need to follow inherited corridors simply because they always had, that routes could be drawn according to real distance, real conditions, and real needs, not legacy arrangements. This was the logic behind free and flexible routing. In practical terms, it meant allowing pilots and air traffic controllers to choose the most efficient path between 2 points, rather than forcing aircraft through rigid waypoints designed for another era. In conceptual terms, it meant something far more disruptive. It meant treating efficiency as a choice, not a constraint. As reconstructed from regulatory briefings and industry accounts, early implementations focused on technical gains, fuel savings, reduced flight times, lower emissions, improvements that could be measured in minutes and kilograms. But beneath those metrics, something else was happening. Each shortened route reduced dependence on external hubs. Each minute saved weakened the argument that African aviation had to be expensive. Each optimization quietly questioned who truly controlled the sky. Airlines began to notice the difference. Fuel is the single largest operational cost in aviation. Even marginal reductions translate into significant savings over time. Shorter routes meant fewer refueling stops, leaner maintenance cycles, and more predictable scheduling. For carriers long squeezed by thin margins, efficiency was no longer an abstract goal. It was survival. Regulators, too, were forced to adapt. Managing flexible airspace required coordination across borders, data sharing, trust, a willingness to prioritize collective benefit over individual caution. These were not purely technical adjustments. They were political ones, dressed in operational language. And reactions were mixed. Some welcomed the shift as overdue modernization. Others approached it carefully, aware that changing routes also meant changing influence. Airspace is not just empty sky. It is revenue, responsibility, and risk. To open it differently is to renegotiate relationships that have existed for decades. International observers framed the developments as efficiency reforms. Industry groups highlighted sustainability gains. But within the continent, a deeper interpretation began to circulate. This was not just about saving fuel, it was about reclaiming agency. Because for too long, African aviation had been defined by what it lacked: capital, scale, connectivity. Efficiency challenged that narrative. It suggested that control over systems could matter as much as ownership of assets. A shorter route did not require new aircraft. It required permission, or rather the decision to stop asking for it. And once that decision was made, the effects rippled outward. Logistics planners recalculated costs. Regional trade discussions gained urgency. The assumption that distance justified dependency began to erode. Yet this transformation was not frictionless. Flexible routing demanded upgraded infrastructure, skilled personnel, and harmonized standards. It exposed gaps in training and technology. It forced uncomfortable conversations about readiness and responsibility. Critics cautioned against moving too fast. Supporters warned against moving too slowly. But even the debate itself marked a turning point. For the first time, the question was no longer whether African skies could be more efficient, but who would shape that efficiency. Because once efficiency becomes visible, it becomes political. It reveals where value leaks out. It exposes who benefits from complexity. And it highlights how much power has been surrendered quietly, through habit rather than necessity. In this moment, aviation stopped being a background system. It became a mirror reflecting broader choices about integration, sovereignty, and self-determination. A reminder that control does not always announce itself through force. Sometimes it is exercised through optimization. Still, efficiency alone could not carry the weight of transformation. Saving fuel did not automatically build resilience. Shorter routes did not resolve deeper structural constraints, and technical reform by itself could not answer the larger question now forming. If control over routes could shift power in the skies, what would happen when that same logic reached the ground? Because beyond efficiency, a more consequential reckoning was beginning to take shape. Efficiency does not live in the sky alone. Its absence is felt on the ground. When routes are long, costs travel with them. They pass quietly from cockpit to cargo hold, from balance sheet to marketplace, until they settle into everyday life, embedded in prices, delays, and lost opportunity. In many African economies, aviation is not a luxury system. It is a connective tissue. When it falters, entire sectors feel the strain. Goods take longer to arrive. Fresh produce loses value mid-journey. Medical supplies become more expensive than they should be. Small exporters find themselves priced out of regional markets before they even begin. These outcomes are often explained as logistical challenges, but logistics, at their core, are political. They determine who can move, how fast, and at what cost. For airlines, the consequences are even more immediate. Years of inefficient routing have left many carriers operating with thin margins and aging fleets. Aircraft fly longer hours than necessary. Maintenance schedules tighten. The cost of keeping planes airworthy rises steadily, particularly when specialized repairs and parts must be sourced from outside the continent. This is where the hidden burden becomes visible. Maintenance, repair, and overhaul capacity remains limited across much of Africa. As a result, airlines rely heavily on external facilities, foreign expertise, and long-distance servicing. Each dependency adds cost. Each cost reduces competitiveness. And each reduction in competitiveness reinforces the idea that African carriers are destined to remain small, fragile, and subordinate. But this narrative overlooks a critical truth. These outcomes are not inevitable. They are the result of accumulated choices. Choices about infrastructure investment, choices about coordination versus fragmentation, choices about whether efficiency is treated as a shared objective or a competitive threat. As routing becomes more efficient, these choices are exposed. Shorter flights reduce wear on aircraft. Lower fuel consumption eases financial pressure. More predictable schedules improve planning and reliability. Taken together, these changes begin to alter the civil economy of a flight. For passengers, this can mean lower fares and better connections. For businesses, it opens regional supply chains once deemed unviable. For governments, it reframes aviation from a cost center into a development tool. And it is here that the conversation crosses from economics into politics. Because when systems become more efficient, they redistribute leverage. States that once accepted high costs as unavoidable begin to question why those costs existed at all. Policymakers start to see logistics not as inherited constraints, but as arenas of reform. The language shifts from managing limitations to asserting control. In some countries, this shift aligns with broader debates about sovereignty, dignity, and self-determination. Not in the theatrical sense, but in the operational one. Who controls critical infrastructure? Who sets the terms of access? Who benefits from complexity? And who pays for it? Within this context, leadership narratives emerge, not as singular causes, but as symbols of a wider mood. Figures associated with economic independence and systemic reform are often invoked, sometimes explicitly, sometimes by implication, as examples of a continent reassessing its options. In this climate, names like Ibrahim Traoré circulate not because aviation policy revolves around individuals, but because efficiency has become part of a larger story about choice. A story in which dignity is measured not by slogans, but by systems that work. Still, progress remains uneven. Improved routing alone cannot overcome weak infrastructure, limited training capacity, or fragmented regulatory frameworks. Efficiency reveals potential, but it also reveals gaps. It forces institutions to confront their own readiness and their own reluctance. Some governments move quickly, seeing opportunity. Others hesitate, wary of risk and responsibility. Regional coordination advances in one area, stalls in another. This unevenness creates tension. Citizens begin to ask why reform is possible in one corridor, but not another. Businesses compare costs across borders. Airlines question why efficiencies achieved in the air are undermined on the ground. And slowly, the civil conversation deepens. Efficiency is no longer framed as a technical upgrade. It becomes a question of governance, of capacity, of intent. Because once people see that systems can be redesigned, acceptance fades. The old explanations lose their weight, and patience with inherited inefficiency wears thin. What began as a recalculation of routes now touches the foundations of economic policy and political legitimacy. And as these pressures build domestically, they do not remain contained. They spill outward into regional dynamics, international perceptions, and the broader geopolitical landscape. Because when the cost of flying changes, so does the balance of power watching from beyond the horizon. Changes in the sky rarely go unnoticed on the ground, especially beyond borders. As routing efficiencies began to take shape across parts of the continent, reactions formed quietly in regional institutions and foreign capitals alike, not alarmed, not celebratory, but attentive. Within continental bodies, the language remained technical: integration, harmonization, capacity building. The African Union framed aviation reform as infrastructure modernization, a necessary layer beneath trade, mobility, and long-term growth. Regional blocs echoed the tone, balancing collective ambition with national caution. Because airspace is shared, but responsibility is not, every step toward coordination raised familiar questions. Who manages risk? Who pays for upgrades? Who arbitrates when interests diverge? These were not new debates, but efficiency gave them new urgency. When routes shorten, accountability lengthens. Beyond the continent, the response was measured. International aviation organizations highlighted safety and environmental benefits. Industry observers noted cost reductions and operational gains. Sustainability narratives found a convenient case study in fuel savings and emissions avoided. Yet beneath the neutral vocabulary, calculations were shifting. For decades, Africa's aviation system had been integrated into global networks as a peripheral component, dependent on external hubs, insurance markets, and technical services. Inefficiency, while costly, had also been predictable. It sustained certain roles, certain flows, certain expectations. Efficiency disrupted that equilibrium. Shorter routes implied fewer stopovers. Stronger regional networks reduced reliance on distant transit points. Improved coordination suggested growing institutional confidence. None of these amounted to confrontation, but it did amount to recalibration. Foreign partners adjusted their assessments. Airlines revisited strategies. Logistics firms modeled new corridors. The question was no longer whether African aviation would modernize, but how far and under whose terms. This recalibration was especially visible when efficiency aligned with political symbolism. Countries often seen through the lens of instability or dependency began to appear in a different context, as participants in systemic reform rather than passive recipients of it. In that frame, Burkina Faso surfaced not as a destination, but as a reference point in conversations about autonomy, coordination, and the reassertion of control over national systems. Again, the change was subtle. No declarations of independence were issued from control towers. No treaties were torn up in the name of routing algorithms. But perceptions began to adjust. Efficiency suggested competence. Competence suggested agency. And agency reshapes how power is interpreted. At the same time, external actors remained pragmatic. They emphasized partnership, technical assistance, standards alignment. The message was clear. Reform was welcome, as long as it remained orderly. Yet order itself was being redefined. When systems improve without external direction, influence shifts quietly. When coordination emerges from within, narratives lose their monopoly. And when efficiency becomes visible, dependence becomes harder to justify. Still, this was only one layer of a larger transformation. International attention acknowledged the changes, but it did not determine their outcome. The decisive choices lay closer to home, in how gains were consolidated, how institutions matured, and how reform translated into resilience. Because the world may observe the sky, but it does not fly the routes. And as these international calculations settled into a new equilibrium, a final question pressed forward, one that no external lens could answer. What happens when efficiency stops being an experiment and becomes a path chosen deliberately all the way to the horizon? Efficiency, once revealed, refuses to remain small. What began as a technical correction, a shorter route, a cleaner line across the sky, now stands at the edge of a larger decision. Because when systems start to work, expectations rise. And when expectations rise, so does responsibility. The road ahead is neither simple nor guaranteed. Airspace reform demands more than algorithms. It requires infrastructure that can sustain precision, training that can keep pace with complexity, institutions capable of coordinating across borders without retreating into suspicion. These are not minor challenges. They are the quiet tests that determine whether reform deepens or stalls. There are risks. Fragmentation could return under pressure. Investment could lag behind ambition. Efficiency could be captured unevenly, benefiting a few corridors while others remain trapped in old patterns. But there are also opportunities, rare and structural. Shorter routes can anchor stronger regional trade. Lower costs can stabilize airlines long forced into survival mode. Improved reliability can attract investment not through promises, but through performance. Most importantly, efficiency can restore dignity to systems long treated as liabilities. Because when movement becomes affordable and predictable, people plan differently. Businesses expand with confidence. States shift from managing scarcity to shaping growth. The sky stops being a constraint and starts becoming a platform. This is where the metaphor completes its arc. What was once a road bent by history can become a bridge built by choice. And that bridge does not lead outward in search of a validation. It leads forward, toward a horizon defined internally. Across the continent, this logic is quietly taking hold. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but with enough consistency to matter. The lesson is not that aviation reform will solve every challenge. It will not. But it demonstrates something deeper. That sovereignty does not always arrive with spectacle. Sometimes it arrives with optimization, with a decision to stop flying in circles, with the courage to redraw the path, with the patience to build systems that serve rather than drain. In this sense, African skies offer more than efficiency. They offer a preview, a glimpse of what becomes possible when nations choose control over convenience, when cooperation outweighs inertia, when dignity is embedded not in words, but in workflows. The horizon, once distant, is now visible. And the final question is no longer whether a shorter route exists, but whether it will be taken consistently, deliberately, and together. Because the future of sovereignty may not roar across the sky, it may glide quietly along the most efficient path forward. In the end, the story of African skies is not about aircraft, it is about choice. For decades, inefficiency was treated as destiny, an unfortunate cost of geography, history, or scale. Long routes were accepted. High prices were normalized. Dependency was explained away as technical necessity. But that explanation no longer holds, because once routes shorten, excuses fade. Once systems optimize, power shifts, and once control is reclaimed, even quietly, dignity follows. What we have witnessed is not a revolution announced with noise, but a recalibration carried out with intent. A reminder that sovereignty does not always arrive through confrontation. Sometimes it arrives through competence, through the patient work of redesigning systems, through cooperation that favors function over fear, through the discipline of choosing efficiency where dependency once hid. This is why the implications stretch far beyond aviation. When logistics improve, trade breeds. When costs fall, opportunity spreads. When institutions prove capable, confidence grows. Across the continent, these changes echo larger conversations about agency and self-determination. They align with a generation of leadership thinking differently about power, less as spectacle, more as structure. In that sense, figures such as Ibrahim Traoré are often referenced not for aviation policy itself, but for what efficiency symbolizes, the refusal to accept inherited limitations as permanent. And the symbolism matters, because when a nation like Burkina Faso is discussed not only in terms of crisis, but in terms of control and coordination, narratives begin to shift. The lens widens. Possibility enters the frame. Still, this path forward demands discipline. Efficiency must be defended against fragmentation. Coordination must outlast politics, and reform must be measured not by announcements, but by continuity. Yet the direction is now visible. The old image of Africa flying in circles is giving way to something more precise, more deliberate, more confident. And that confidence, built on systems that work, is the most enduring form of power. This is the quiet lesson written across the sky, that freedom does not always look dramatic, that sovereignty can be engineered, and that the future often belongs to those who choose the shorter, smarter route. If this story resonates with your sense of dignity and direction, remain with us. The continent is still redrawing its map, and the next line is already taking shape.